All right. Our objectives for today then are to identify the key components for animating, to explain the need and uses for timing and spacing, and then to actually create and demonstrate use of timing and spacing for a bouncing ball. All right, so by the end of today, you'll all have an animation. So, all right, really, really basic. Firstly, so Maya, so let's get into software and identify some key components for animating. Yes?
Didn't we do this in year 1?
You did a small thing of it, but now we're going to go in more detail. All right, so could you open up Maya for me, please? Alright, remember Maya doesn't automatically load in, it takes a little while to load with Alembic. At the bottom there. Alright, you will be happy to learn, as part of this module, you are not expected to model anything. Alright? If you decide, as part of your final piece, to model this beautiful environment, like a sweeping hillside with cascading waterfalls, that's fantastic. And you've got a very brief character just going like that. You fail. It's completely superfluous. It has no bearing on your grade whatsoever.
But what if the background's animated?
What if the background's animated? It's not what I'm asking you to do, so you wouldn't get it. All right. So, first things first, who's used Maya in a while? Who's not used Maya in a while?
Not in a while. I'm not used in a while.
Yeah.
I've used this year 1.
Okay.
Yeah. It's like riding a bike.
It's like riding a bike. All right, so does someone want to tell me how to just sort of navigate my viewport? What are the controls?
Space. Alt and mouse buttons.
Alt and mouse buttons, correct.
Different.
No. All right, so yes, Alt and the mouse button. So Alt and left click allows us to tumble, Alt and right click allows us to scrubby zoom, and Alt and middle click allows us to pan. Simple as. All right. The key differences about using Maya to animate rather than to model is we use this thing down here. All right. Anyone remember what they're called?
Keyframe.
Nope.
Oh, is that a timeline?
Timeline and timeline's the top bit. What's the bottom bit? It begins with R. Oh, this bottom section is your range slider. All right, so that's this thing here. So the range slider essentially allows us to change how many frames we've got visible on our keyframe. Oh, not on our keyframe, on our timelines. You've got me saying keyframe. No. All right. A timeline is made up of frames. Does anyone know what a frame is?
Something that stores properties of an object.
A still image. When frames get put together. Well, you put around a picture and you've got transformation.
No. A frame is a still image. All right. Rather than just a picture, it is a still image. What's a keyframe?
The one that unlocks.
It's a still image with a very definite point of data on it. All right. So if you were to have, say, someone moving about, but you've got a keyframe where someone's like that, no matter what, it will always be that position on that frame. Because you've keyframed all of those points to be exactly in that position. And that if you were to change that somewhere in the middle, that might change. So what we're going to do is just going to create a quick bouncing ball. All right, very, very quick. I'm just going to get moving about. All right, so first off, create a sphere, pop it in your scene. Then, once it's in your scene, just have it somewhere above your grid. I'm going to chuck mine about there. All right, so somewhere about there. All right, so obviously you guys did a little bit of 3D animation last year. Does someone want to tell me what the next step is?
We're going to the next frame.
Okay, well, what have we not got? We've not got a keyframe. So how do we set a keyframe? Remember how to set a keyframe? All right, there's one. All right. So an important part to remember is that every object in Maya has its own timeline. Every object, every controller, every performer, every object, all has its own timeline, and it's all represented down here on this thing. All right, so if I've got two spheres in there, each one's going to have different keyframes on it because they've got different timelines. However, the range will always be the same. So what I want to do is make sure I've got this selected. Make sure I'm on frame 1, the bottom left, and then press S. What's happened? Result 10, yeah. Check the timeline.
Red line.
Your red line.
Yeah.
That is your indicator that a keyframe has been set. All right, so I'll just zoom in for those of you that aren't able to see. Use our lovely magnifier tool. Jump. There we go. So it looks like that. All right. You always know a keyframe is set on that frame because it's just before the number. Okay, so we can see there it's just before that frame. All right. If by any chance you've got a keyframe on, say, here, and you're wondering, well, actually, no, that looks like it's on frame 3. If it's after, it's not on the frame. All right. Our next step is to find out roughly how long this is going to take to hit the ground. So, how long do you reckon it would take for me to, say, drop a ball from here to the ground?
A second.
A second. Okay. Let's use this what ball? Let's use it. Alright. Probably same density as the ball. Alright, so. Try again. How long?
Let me get time a bit. One is like a little bit. I agree with a second.
When you ready? And go. Literally a second. So standard height, about there. Obviously, I'm slightly taller.
About 60 frames.
Yeah. So it's about a second. How many FPS is mine?
24.
24. All right. You can tell the frames per second for your scene. There's right next to your range slider. You can see it right there. All right. You can change that if you wish. You can change it to 5 FPS all the way up to that.
Why would you go to 48?
I put up.
Yeah, why would you go to 48?
Because some people are just gratuitous.
I have. What does that even do? What does that even do? I have an option on mine for 23.976.
A rather lucrative amount of our frames.
Why is it on 59.972? What?
All right. So,
Why would you have?
what runs at 24 FPS? In general media, what runs at 24 FPS? Movies. All right. What runs at 29.97 FPS? Nope. British TV shows. and that British soaps run at 33 frames per second, and American TV shows run at 27 frames per second.
Run at like 40?
Because they are idiots. Basically, as we developed new technology, certain things adapted different frames. All right. So we're going to keep with 24 FPS for default. If you want to change it, by all means, you can do that. However, when you change your frames per second, it will change the placement of your keyframes. All right. So just because you might be on 15 FPS and then go, actually, you know what, I want to go to 30, that the distance will increase between, then you may end up with something at like half the frame. All right. So be careful with that. Always choose your frames per second before you move on to anything else. So we're going to keep at that. So if it's a second for it to drop to the ground, what do I need to set my keyframe on where it's on the ground?
24.
24. All right, so I go to frame 24. I'll drag this down to the ground. I tumble. Make sure I have a look. So it doesn't have to be 100% accurate, so that'll do. All right. Then when I've moved it on that frame, I press S. All right. Always remember, it is choose your frame, position your object, then keyframe. All right. Choose your frame, position your object, keyframe. Always that order. Don't move your object, then move frame, because it will just snap back. All right. So I've got that set there. Well, at the moment, my range slider at the moment is set to only show 120 on here, but to a maximum of 200. Okay, that's these two values down here. So that's these two here. So I just want to make sure I'm only working within about 2 seconds. So let's go change that to 48 by 48. All right. So I've only got 48 frames now in my scene. And lo and behold, 24 is now slap bang in the middle, so at least we know where it's going to hit the ground. Then what I want you guys to do is just press the play button. All right?
Oh boy.
What does it say?
Beady boy.
Raise your hands, people that have got really, really, really fast balls.
I know
Alright, so just going crazy.
Yes.
Alright, that, if your ball is going mental,
Is it too low?
alright,
I'm assuming it means your ball starts way too low.
no, it's not at all.
Is it because it's reset and it's snapping back?
No. Because what happens is, by default, Maya's playback speed, which you can edit by going right-clicking on the play button. So let's just zoom into it. All right. So if we go here, right-click, go to playback speed. All right. By default, it's set to play every frame free, which essentially goes, well, you've got a really powerful graphics card. We'll use it all. And it will play at a ridiculous speed.
When's the last one?
We stick with real time, which essentially caps it to 24 frames per second, but it will skip frames if you've got a lower end graphics card. But it gives you the most consistent level of detail. If you do play every frame max real time, it'll play every single frame across it with a maximum of real time, but what it will do is, if you then try and go and switch to a different machine that's got a lower graphics card, it will then start to falter. All right, it's going to give you something that looks really nice, but it's inconsistent. So just stick it to real time, and your animation will be a lot more in flow, like so. All right. So it should just go.
It like glides.
Like that. Yeah. All right. Now what we need to do is we need to get back up to the top. Anyone remember the next process? Go for it.
Can you just copy and paste it first, right?
All right. How do we copy and paste it without using copy and paste?
This is just like. No. You can hold the button, you can drag it.
We can move keyframes by holding shift, left clicking, and it'll turn it like this amber colour, and you can move it by dragging. But we don't want to drag. What we want to do is we want to copy this. So to copy a keyframe, all right, we select the frame we want to copy. We middle click the frame we want to copy it to, and then we press S. All right, and what that middle click does is it creates a snapshot of the frame. So whatever is currently on screen, it creates a snapshot of it. So you can copy any key, you can essentially copy any keyframe that's currently in that position from the original frame. All right, yep. So to do that, you select the frame you want, you middle click to the frame you want to copy it to, and then you press S. And then when you play it, our ball will drop to the ground and then go back up. Hey?
Oh, you do that.
You don't have a middle click?
You
actually have to do copy and paste.
That's so smooth.
Alright.
Xbox has never seen it before.
So, what's the first thing we're all noticing?
It glides and it doesn't like bounce like a ball.
It doesn't bounce like a ball. What does it look like?
It looks like I'm using the force.
Looks like you're moving the force. It's really floaty. Alright? The term floaty will come up a lot because, well, it is really floaty. Who's played a game where the controls feel really floaty, the character feels really floaty?
Yeah.
Alright. Counter-Strike Source. Who's played Halo 3?
Yes.
Where your character, you know, you hear sort of this huge chunking arm like that, and you go. That, when you move, you just kind of go. Yeah. Everything feels really uncomfortably light. All right.
You'd think that actually adds some like
makes for a faster game, but that's what's happening here. All right, that's what's happening here with this. All right, it's feeling too light. All right, it doesn't feel like a ball is dropping. It feels like it's just going down and up, down and up. All right, which then brings us to our principle. Yes. All right. So we've gone over the keyframes, which is represented by a timeline, which stores exact data for the object on the keyframe. Tweens. This is the thing we haven't gone over yet. So it is the space between two keyframes. All right. So you'll all notice on your timeline you've only got 3 keyframes: one at 1, one at 24, one at 48. In between them, they are the tweens, and it's Maya automatically interpreting or interpolating the information for you. So it goes, well, it's going to be roughly this speed as it goes through, and it's going to be roughly this speed going out, and it's going to gently go into this keyframe and gently out. All right, it's quite nice, really easy.
Is interpolating a word?
Interpolation is a word. Check it.
Just like
I've never heard of the said word.
You've never heard of interpolation? If I actually typed it in. Hey? If it actually lets me type it in. Interpolate. There you go. Inserting something into something else. So what it's doing is it's inserting data in that tween into the frames until it gets to another point. Yeah. Well, the image is. That's a tangent. All right. Yeah, I bet you are glad you guessed. All right. So this is where we look at timing and spacing. All right. So timing and spacing in animation is essentially how long it takes to complete an action. So we did the test with the water bottle. It took roughly a second for it to drop from my hand to the ground. And it allows us to see how far each pose is apart from the next. So we got roughly the idea of how long that action takes. Super fast animations add excitement, urgency, and hyperactivity. Alright, slower and extended timings create a sense of dread, build-up, and power. Right, so it's quite an interesting sort of thing when it comes to timing and spacing. So there's some pictures for you. In this case, like we're doing at the moment, or some people doing 60 FPS because they are the PC Master Race. In this case, 24 frames equals 1 second. Okay, so 24 frames, go around there, or to reach from point A to point B. All right, pretty nice. This even amount of spacing in between frames means we're going to have an even distribution of time between each frame. All right, so for us, moving from this to the ground in 1 second, that makes sense. No, it's going to get to that point. However, what's the difference? When it drops, is it an even distribution of time?
No.
What happens?
No.
What happens as it drops?
It
Accelerates.
It accelerates. All right. So it cannot. Our keyframes cannot look anything like that because that means our timing is wrong. And that if it fell at the same amount of time, so if it took a second to get to the ground, it would look floating like so. It wouldn't feel right. It wouldn't feel natural. It doesn't have weight. So if I just get rid of the magnifier. Yep. So when we look at our spacing, it's a change in position. Okay, so our timing is how long it takes the action to do something. Spacing is the distance covered. So in 24 frames, if you have 24 frames of it moving somewhere, all right, so a second, if there is less change between of those keyframes, so less change of space within those 24, it's a slower action. So those of you that have got your balls quite low to the ground, what's going to happen if you're moving it to the ground, it's going to look really slow. Take for instance Elliot's. Elliot's ball is really close to the ground. All right, and what it does, it just feels like an orb just hovering up and down, whereas Tom's is quite high in the air, and so it still has an increased pace, but they're still happening over the same amount of frames. So this is where it gets a bit like in your head. It's a bit of mess. It messes with you a bit. So let's take a look at the opposite. Have I got the other one in there? No. All right. So if you wanted to increase it, if you wanted to increase the speed, you would essentially have more change of space, all right, with less keyframes. But if you wanted to make it decelerate, this is where it gets interesting, because your change in position starts off very small. So okay, so it's very small. So down here, this is where you'll have this very, very tiny piece of movement. All right, so it's very, very short amount of distance covered. All right, so if you wanted to decelerate someone walking, if I'm just walking at a normal pace like this, okay, I'm covering a reasonable amount of distance, amount of space, like that. But if I was to decelerate, what would happen? You would eventually come to a halt, like so. Like that. But I decelerate, so the space I travel decreases over time. All right, but it's still over a second. Here's an example from one of the Disney Pixar animators. And this person's absolutely fantastic. They've got the full 12 principles out there. But you see at the top, we have an even distribution of frames. It still looks cool, it still looks nice. And that, however, we get much more impact by using deceleration and acceleration, where it sort of speeds up and then goes, slows in.
It looks like it's got flaws.
But they're using the exact same amount of frames over that second, so it's still 24 frames. So using that would help our ball or our water bottle seem like it's got much more weight and impact. Okay? So, that's what we're going to do. We're going to make this ball, over those 24 frames, decelerate and accelerate. So how are we going to do that? So hazard a guess. Go for it.
Do you know when it's in the ground, would you add like more of the red lines near that? So
More of the red lines, use your keywords.
keyframes?
Keyframes.
That's it.
So
You have more of them in the middle, so it slows down when it bounces, and like there's more gaps between going up and down.
all right. So what happens when something, if you throw something into the air? What happens to it?
It slows down.
It slows down, and when it comes towards the ground, it accelerates. So what we need to do is we need to accelerate this ball hitting the ground, and then as it goes back up, we need to decelerate it. So what I want you guys to do is have a go doing. Right, using that idea of acceleration and deceleration. All right, so I'll leave that on the board. All right, if you can do that for me, please. Alright, Sam. Unfortunately, I genuinely have no idea about regeneration. Alright, if you want to, if you can bounce the ball from the Alright, the theory is exactly the same.
Right click on the play button. Right click on the play button and play back to Steve. And then restart. Yeah.
I mean, if you were listening,
It heads up restart.
See, I kind of did it. I framed it a little better, but I kind of did it. Just like well, I figured it out. I just need to do it in more frames so it's smooth. It just kind of gets angry and just like drops. Should talk about a few frames.
so it should needs to start off slow, covering a very small amount of distance. Then go. Right, what it's doing is getting halfway down and then really accelerating. It's like it's getting halfway down and
Matt,
yes.
do you have any idea? Look, when I move my mouse like that.
No, that is a new one. Maybe stop playing.
Well, yeah.
Just scribble on the timeline. Okay, no, that
I
is.
don't know why mine is being very slow.
No, have you got GeForce?
Well, I have that.
Just restart your machine and try again without having everything open. Is he running AMD?
No.
I don't know if you're on AMD.
No, I'm not running AMD anyway.
You just got a PC snob over there.
Yeah.
Everything's got to be what 4K, 60 FPS now.
The updated your drivers, GeForce drivers.
Oh, you see, with AMD you don't need to do that. So you release a standard HQL license.
Except I get update reminders every week.
Yes, because they're beta drivers and they're optional.
They're really annoying. Mine just freezes on the floor.
That showed me deceleration, so that's good. Yeah.
We checked the update.
I don't know why.
Give it an hour.
No, I have the latest.
So you're accelerating into the air.
See, I figured it out and then I realised.
Decelerate as it goes into the air. So go really fast off the ground, there's a big push of momentum to the ground. And then decelerate.
How did that? How you doing?
I figured out how you do it, but I can't work out.
That's why I have this. Alright.
I should leave it on the drive.
Right click the keyframe and do delete.
I think it's nice. No, it's your thing.
Who's pushing your
Oh, you're going to have to beat the two.
How do I mean?
Alright.
Okay.
So, right now, what's going to happen is the ball is going to be really slow across here. Okay? Those will be something like. Yeah, looking at spacing. I don't think these are frames, I think these are spaces.
How do you get rid of the keyframe?
Select the keyframe you want to get rid of and right click and delete. Yeah. Right? So, you've got a really small concentrated amount of space here. Then, as gravity starts to kick in, it's going to start travelling much more distance for
Probably doing that.
the next key frame. Right, really small then. Right, and then as it comes back up, it's going to be the same. Right, and it gets really close towards the end because they peak over, slow, fast.
I guess you're trying to plug in the middle. You just gotta put load. Do one every car.
Oh boy, Windows.
It's still on. Like one every 8 is what he tried to say. Oh no, I messed up something.
That sounds like you.
Also, I went to that
It's a ceiling that was running.
that it doesn't mean the ceiling shrunk.
The ceiling is running.
I just found out where it does that bit there. A lot of keyframes, like keyframe, like what the fixing for is?
Oh, crazy man. That's some cool
Cool math games there, boys. I'm doing my head now, so it's okay. It's a very ungeographic, right?
Yeah,
Just like the opposite of what we want.
Okay, so that should have slowed it down a touch.
higher.
Because that one is the that one.
Yeah, it'll be in place of the original fight.
It was this.
But that's not how.
I'm making out way right.
Just lower it and then just cats. Or why do you move that point to the end and then move that point over to the middle? Yeah, because then it'll still go all.
Why is the jump? Where is the jump happening? See that further to the body. Where is the jump happening? There. Right there is where the jump happens. It's crazy. 132 to go.
No, it's just, I've had to turn it back on.
Now we're so close. That's
I was saying, by all means, if you get too cold in there, just stand in here for a bit. Alright.
We're gonna
You know what
fight.
what are the called? Can you get like ghost trains on there?
Onion skinning.
Yeah, I think that's what's called. You know where you want to see the previous keyframes.
Yeah, we'll do that later.
Because that one made this process so
When we've got a
easy.
lot more keyframes, you kind of shut yourself in the foot by doing 60 FPS. Fact.
It's not the 60 FPS.
It is 60 FPS because you've got more frames in there.
I can do it.
Control.
I can do it.
Well, I'll try something believe in.
I don't believe in you.
Alright? You'll end up, when you apply it, with something like that, right? Very subtle, but you can see and feel the difference of it hitting the ground and then bouncing back up. Slower,
Like can.
like so.
Wait, are we actually morphing the
We'll move off the ball later, yeah. Alright. Let's have a look.
Are you doing like 4 keyframes?
Yep.
I don't. How does that make sense?
Oh my god.
Because between this keyframe and this keyframe, it moves a very short amount of distance. Right? Between this keyframe and this keyframe, it moves. So what? Remember, that's this.
Overclock everything. Why don't you tell us the last two keyframes? Doesn't matter. Delete the last two keyframes and work from there. If I can't run it, it's a problem with the software. It's not going to happen. It's going to get loud though.
Now just breathe it up slightly.
Yeah, it runs! I mean, I overclocked literally everything, but it runs. And now it sounds like a jet engine, but it runs!
Congratulations on that. You did. It might still right along. Yeah. It's good for just research.
Okay, for those of you that are struggling, I left the remote over there, so I can't do that.
He's so loud. And
that, you only need about 4 keyframes to do this. Alright? An important thing you will come to learn is that the less keyframes you have, strangely enough, the more control you have. Alright? So, I'm going to create a duplicate ball.
I'll figure this out. I'm a man of sitting this. Male Jones.
Alright? And the idea is, as you can see the difference between the balls there. Now, what we can do is if we say the midpoint of this ball falling, which is frame 12, notice by this point, this ball here has already travelled a significant less distance, alright? So its spacing is different, even though it has something on keyframe 12. So what we can do is we could add that up. Let's see what happens if we put it a little bit higher. Press S. And then watch what happens. Alright? Notice the difference when it falls to the ground. See that slam? And all we've done is put in 1 keyframe. It goes like that. And what you can do is immediately then duplicate that frame on frame 36, because that's another 12 afterwards. Like that. And you get it bouncing, hitting the ground, going back up. It's a little bit more energetic. On the right, that's the one I've just done. On the left, that was the one I did earlier. So you can see how it's decelerating and accelerating as we go up. Alright? And all it's doing is that same practicality. Alright? In fact, let me get a visual representation of my keyframe on the board. Let's do it on here, actually.
Can you spot the bridge? You spot the ball. You did it! By the end.
Oh, we resorted to doing it before.
Dude, stress from this
Not right now, not right
Sorry,
now.
I'm trying to figure out my own. I can't
That's
figure
not a
out
good
my
sign. You should go with podcast, dude. You can get pants.
It's almost like without you.
Is this something?
Is this something?
Alright. In case you aren't necessarily getting it from that, remember, you are moving from the top to the bottom in 24 frames. From the bottom to the top in 24 frames. Right? You need to show deceleration. So, if we would say here at frame 12, you are at the midpoint, and the same here at frame 36. if we wanted to show acceleration, where would we move the midpoint on here? Would we make sure the midpoint is still at frame 12, or would we make it closer to here?
Make it closer.
We make it closer to here, exactly. So the midpoint needs to be in here somewhere. Right, whereas here is closer to this end. Right, because then you are travelling a short distance here, a large distance here. Right, remember your spacing. If you travel a short amount of distance over a certain amount of frames, it's normal. But if you then make it travel a larger distance over the same amount of frames, it's going to seem a lot quicker. Remember Elliot's low ball?
I moved it higher.
You moved it higher because then it looks like it's moving faster.
Yeah.
Exactly. All right. More distance over short time equals speedy. All right. If you don't get it, that's your equation. All right. This is maths. Oh God. Yes. Surprise! Logarithms. So yes, the more distance you travel over a shorter amount of time, it increases your speed. All right. And then the reverse happens when you decelerate. All right. So the less distance you can travel over a longer amount of time, the slower you are. Imagine walking down a road, or imagine walking to class. All right, imagine having to go to class. You don't really want to go there. It's the same distance. You always make me like you slow down, same amount of distance, it'll take you longer, and then you just slower. It bumps up a little bit.
It's got a speed boost. It's so fast.
Yeah, it's like that.
I meant that ball jump.
What?
Made it look like it's jumping.
Mine just doesn't turn out as smooth. It just never looks as smooth. It's just really janky, like when it speeds up.
When it speeds up, you're slowing it down too much. All right. For those of you that have done it, what I want you to do is I want you to get it to look like it bounces when it hits the ground, please.
Keep it as it is.
All right.
So what? One thing.
All right. Bounces too quick. It's still slamming.
Anytime my brain
All right. So what's your midpoint? Frame 30.
yeah.
All right. So go to frame 30.
I did 145, which will be the midpoint if I delete that.
Right. So delete that. So go to frame 30. All right. Bring it up slightly. No, press S. You're not moving the frame at the midpoint, you're moving the midpoint with the distance. That's
See, I was thinking it the opposite way more, moving it down.
Still
that's it.
The opposite direction is bounce faster and more.
I should flip this.
Pretty much it.
How do you remove a keyframe?
Right thing, flip the way.
Yeah, right click the frame.
Then I'll move this down.
How long do you have again, Jordan? You said 4.
So you see how the junkiness looks a little bit more there?
Yeah,
Right, so
Big ideals. Oh yeah, I was saying like initially you need 4.
Oh yeah, this year before, yeah.
Alright, so who's going to
No!
Yeah.
don't press the delete key. Alright, who remembers how to compress the ball?
Change the scale. Yeah.
Change the scale. Okay, so walk me through it.
when you go to your middle keyframe, I suppose, keyframe 24 should be.
Okay, so let's use this one here. All right, so I go to frame 24. What do I do?
Press R.
R.
And then you scale it.
Scale it down.
You'll probably have to move it down so it touches the floor again though.
Okay, so let's move it down so it touches the floor.
And then press S.
And press S. All right, what's going to be the issue?
It's going to switch all the way down.
Will it scale all the way through?
Oh yes. So when we do this, we start at the top, it's fine. It accelerates down. But it already starts to crush before we hit the floor.
How do you change that? Yeah,
How do we do that?
a keyframe before and after.
Keyframes before and after. Okay. Now these keyframes can be known as gates. They can be known as pre-poses or anything like that. But what we need to do is either side of it. It doesn't have to be one frame apart. It could be two. All right. Is we need to essentially say at this point here it will not be crushed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to frame 22 and change my scale value back to 1 on there, and then create a keyframe. And I know that's going to be the exact same pose at frame 26, so I'm going to middle click and press S. And then what happens is when the ball drops, it's going to get to that point, hit the ground, and it's going to bounce, like so. Very, very subtle, but it bounces. Except we're missing something. What happens? What are we missing? Right? When you crush in, then we'll see the face get hit.
Yeah.
Alright, what happens to the face when it deforms? It essentially, everything ripples that way.
Yeah.
Well, what happens once it reaches maximum
It like
elasticity?
elasticates back.
Yeah, it goes flang like that, but it doesn't just go. Yes, it will go the other way. And what's happening here with our ball is it's crushing, going back to normal size and then stopping. All right, so we just need to make sure that it follows through. So on my frame 26, where I had it sort of just go back to normal, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stretch it this way a little bit. Like so. And that may be a little bit too much, that. So something like that. And then my frame 28, I'll keyframe it so that it just goes back to scale 1. Like so. So when I now play it, and that it will stretch back out, and it'll look a little bit more natural. Okay. So a little bit when it gets to the ground. It goes like you're telling a dog or a cat. No. You should call it a little gremlin.
My dog looks like a gremlin. With bog wires, those are the good ones. Gremlins have like a patch of look scaly. Shut up. You know what I mean? Probably not, Johnny. That's an issue. Oh my god, actually, we're going to have to mix it. What have you done to me? Actually, don't question my ball. You deal with your ball, I'll deal with my ball. Question my ball.
Scale Y.
And stretch it in.
No, I think it's no process.
Why is it zoomed out?
Dude, mine didn't. Can I zoom out? Look at it.
What's who's in?
Yeah, I'm blending you with the what?
Who's in? Who's it? Not in. Who's it in?
So that's it.
Okay. Once you've got that, save it as bouncing ball, okay? Or bouncy ball or whatever.
Big bouncy ball, yeah.
Oh, one of the wheels is just missing.
It's Heather.
Okay, no, fine,
Alright, if you're still struggling with the timing and spacing, I created my own version of that Pixar thing.
Is this what you made earlier?
Yes. Alright, and you'll be able to tell the difference between them. That first one is literally moving in one direction over the entirety of 36 frames. You've got one moving over two spaces, over both distances of 36 frames, and one with the actual acceleration.
The one in the back of me, the one in the colors.
Yeah, can you show the key frame in the middle one?
Yeah, sure.
And the one in the front is.
When I was
Yeah, the weak number.
So, if I select,
Not to worry.
alright, so the keyframes for this one, I will bring up the graph editor because it's a little bit easy to show you. Alright, each of those yellow dots is a keyframe, alright? That is essentially, so you can see how it goes really, really slow, fast. It's slow, just slows in at the end, decelerates, slowly out, accelerates and decelerates, like so. Alright, so if I was to play it through, and we just dock this to the bottom, like so, you'll then see how it plays through.
Like the top of the box.
Or the wobble,
Yeah.
that's the deformer, that's a different lesson.
It looks like when you slide
When we do deformers, we have to look at adding, removing attributes. We'll go through deformers when we do squash and stretch as a full thing. And overlapping action. But for now, we're just looking at timing and spacing. Alright, so you've got it, 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 you've got it. Don't take it now. What?
Because it is solid elastic.
Elastic. How would you do it? How do you do that?
The reverse sequence, why you give all round earlier on instead of all the way around.
Okay. The next step, alright? This will take you to the end of the lesson. This one. Alright? Two balls again.
Sorry, and then carry on.
How when you drop a bowling ball?
Alright.
Oh, it makes sense.
So what's the interesting thing about these two balls?
One's like when you drop a bowling ball and the other's
The bowling ball doesn't do that.
Alright?
One uses gravity, one does not.
One uses gravity, one uses not. What
Uses gravity, not.
One uses gravity. What about what else is different about it? Don't worry about shadows.
There's actually an end.
Eh?
There's actually an end.
There's an end? Someone said it earlier. I'm not sure if they realised that they said it.
It feels about the same like
It was about the same amount every time, yeah. Who called one of them a tennis ball? You were right. Here you have two different balls. You've got a tennis ball. What's the other one? It's a bowling ball. How do you know what they are?
By the physics.
The physics of them. Alright? Using what we've just learned, okay, creating the bouncing ball with acceleration and deceleration, what I want you guys to do now is to create a scene and create three different types of balls. Alright? One will loop, so one will loop just like that one, which goes up, down, up, down, up, down. And two will come to a stop. Alright? So I chose a bowling ball because it's always quite an entertaining one. And that, considering that you got it first time, was quite surprising.
I think to be fair, they did say first.
So, I want you to create 3 different types of balls, alright? It can be as long as you want, alright? But they will bounce on the spot. There will be no rolling.
Can they bounce on walls?
They can bounce, no, they'll bounce on the spot. Alright, and they'll come to a stop, okay? Alright? You must use, however, the same amount of time for both balls. Well, for all balls that you use. Alright? So mine is 1.5 seconds. Alright? You could do yours for, I don't know, you could do yours for 5 seconds, 6 seconds, however many seconds you want. Alright? But you must use the same amount of frames for it. Okay? You've got an hour. Go. Make an exploding ball. You can go for it. But you must make it bounce. Jesus Christ. Push first. And then remember, walk before you run. In this case, walk before you try and kick the limb.
Oh, before. What would you do first? I don't know.